Well, funny thing happened to me last Sunday night. I turned on what I thought was the 49ers game, Sunday Night Football, and it turned into instead of what I watched was 4 hours of Breaking Bad. It was just a very, very bad night. Hopefully this afternoon's game will go better than that. Well, every few years a new book comes out purporting to reveal who Jesus really was and who he really is. The latest such book you might have seen on the bookshelves is called Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth by an author named Reza Aslan. And Aslan, if you watch any of the news shows, he was on all the news shows this summer on CNN and the Fox News, even the Daily Show on Comedy Central, which is where I first saw him. And in the interview that I watched, Aslan explained to a cheering audience that it's crucial, he said, that we separate the Jesus of history from the Christ of faith. In other words, Aslan explained to the audience that the New Testament writers got Jesus all wrong. Jesus is not, as Christians claim, he said, God in the flesh. Rather, the Jesus of history, he explained, was a member of a political movement called the Zealots, who was intent on overthrowing the Romans, who got himself killed for just that reason, for being a political rabble-rouser. Interestingly, although the book is still a bestseller, scholar after scholar, if you go to the reviews, have pointed out the historical errors, the numerous historical errors that Reza Aslan makes. My favorite critique of the book came not from a Christian scholar, but from the Jewish Book of Reviews, which its title is its review of What Jesus Wasn't, a Zealot. Now, when Jewish scholars come out and say that a writer has completely missed what the Gospels say about who Jesus was, it's pretty hard to take the guy's work seriously. One last point, by the way, that should have been a tip-off about Reza Aslan's book. He's not a professional historian. It turns out he's a professor of creative writing. Perfectly positioned to write a book of history. Well, no matter what Reza Aslan or anyone else might say, the fact is that the New Testament couldn't be clearer about this. Jesus was not a mere political rabble-rouser. He was not a rabbinical superstar. He was not even a superhero. Jesus is God in the flesh. If you ask what we stand for, this is where we draw our line in the sand. This is one of the distinctives of our faith, our belief in the divinity of Jesus, our belief that Jesus is God incarnate, which is what we mean when we say God in the flesh. Now, Reza Aslan, he's hardly the first author to contend that the Christian church has misunderstood who Jesus was and is. One common assertion that's been made for hundreds of years is that Jesus himself never claimed to be God, but it was only those people who came along later, people like the Apostle Paul and the other church fathers who came along hundreds of years later who said, oh yeah, looking back, it looks to us like we think Jesus was God. These critics will contend that if you strip away all these exaggerations and just look at what Jesus said about himself, we'd get an entirely different picture of Jesus. So that's what we're going to do this morning. We're going to drill down on Jesus' own words. We're going to ask ourselves, who did Jesus say he was? Now, here's something that you can't help but notice if you read through the Gospels, if you take the time to read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that Jesus did a significant number of amazing things. He healed the lame. He gave sight to the blind. He raised the dead. He stilled the storms. When you read about what Jesus did, you certainly conclude that Jesus was at the very least a superhero. But when you do a study of the word, you do a word study of this word amazed in the Gospels, it's interesting to note that what amazed the people of Israel, actually much more than what Jesus did, was what Jesus said. Time after time, the Gospels tell us that people were amazed by Jesus' teaching. For example, at the conclusion of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' most famous message, we read this: when Jesus had finished these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching. Later in Matthew's Gospel, he writes this of Jesus: coming to his hometown, he began teaching the people in their synagogue, and they were amazed. In fact, Jesus' teaching was so amazing that it got him to serious trouble. Mark writes this in his Gospel: the chief priests and teachers of the law heard this. They began looking for a way to kill Jesus, for they feared him. Why? Because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching. And what most amazed folks, and what made many of the people of the day so angry, was what Jesus had to say about himself. In fact, that was the reason that Jesus was put on the cross, not because of his political leanings. You've likely heard some folks say something like this about the things about Jesus. They'd say, I don't believe Jesus was God, but I really respect the things that Jesus had to say. I admire what he said about loving your enemies and about the golden rule. And it's true, Jesus did say a lot about love, and those teachings are critically important for us. But none of Jesus' teachings are more important than what Jesus taught about himself. That, by the way, is very different from other religions. Buddhism, for example, does not rise or fall on what Buddha said about himself. The Buddha was a very interesting character, but being a Buddhist does not require you to believe anything unusual about the Buddha. To be a Buddhist means you subscribe to certain beliefs about the nature of reality, about the cause of suffering. Being Buddhist means you engage in certain practices and disciplines. But at the heart of being a Christian is believing what Jesus taught about himself. Yes, there are certain doctrines that we hold in common. That's what we're talking about in this series on the fundamentals of our faith. But ultimately, Christianity is not a philosophy of life. It's not a political party. It's not a collection of principles. Christianity is about a person, the person of Jesus. To be a Christian is to be committed to Jesus' heart and soul. You can take Buddha out of the equation and still be a Buddhist. And while Muhammad is undoubtedly critically important to Muslims, you can actually take Muhammad out of the picture and still have Islam. But if you take Jesus out of the picture, there's no Christianity. If Jesus is not who he said he was, then we who call ourselves Christians, we're simply wasting our time. So what did Jesus claim about himself? What did he say? Who did he say he was? Well, before Reza Aslan's book, the last very popular book to challenge the belief that Jesus is God in the flesh was Dan Brown's book called The Da Vinci Code. You probably remember that one. According to Dan Brown, no one believed that Jesus was God until sometime in the 300s when the Emperor Constantine came along and made everybody believe that. Certainly Dan Brown and these other critics would claim Jesus never made such a preposterous claim about himself. So we're going to test that theory this morning. And we're going to limit ourselves to what Jesus actually taught. We're going to leave out what the gospel writer said. We're going to leave out what Paul and Peter and James had to say about him. We're going to just ask ourselves, who did Jesus say he was? And we'll start with Mark's gospel, which Bible students tell us is the very first gospel to be written down about 20 to 30 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. By the way, and I've been reading about Buddhism a lot this last week, getting ready for a message that is coming up in a few weeks when we're talking about sin and salvation. And this fact struck me. Do you know how long after Buddha lived that his first teachings were actually committed to writing? Buddha lived around the year 500 BC. His followers first put his teachings into writing 400 years later. That's quite a contrast to Mark's gospel, which is written 20 to 30 years after Jesus lived. Well, we'll talk more about that when we talk about why we trust the Bible in a few weeks, too. Well, here's one of the first things Jesus taught about himself, right out of the gate. The story is in Mark 2. It's probably familiar to most of us. Jesus is teaching to a crowd of people who've gathered in a home in Capernaum. A paralyzed man and his 4 friends have heard that Jesus had the power to heal people. So they try to get an audience with Jesus. When they get to the house, the crowd is so large, that there's no way to get in to see Jesus. So they decide to do something, pretty unorthodox. They climb up on top of the house where Jesus is teaching. They tear open the roof, and they lower their paralyzed friend right into the middle of where Jesus was. And then Jesus says something that is completely unexpected, indisputably radical. Here's the text. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven." And notice what some of the people in the crowd are thinking. Here's what Mark writes next. Now some teachers of the law were standing there thinking to themselves, who